What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 393. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you?
I'm doing well. We're on episode 393 out of 400, so I'm pretty excited.
I didn't realize we were in the final stretch.
Yep, we're heading to the finish line, so I'm looking forward to it.
God, you just can't help yourself, can you?
Never have
been able to, right? Yeah. On this episode of the show, we've got a pretty cool one lined up. Luis and I were chatting the other night after we finished recording the last episode of LR, and we came to the realization, or just remembered somehow, that, we've got this fantastic tool at our disposal, which are our patrons, our most invested listeners on the Patreon. And while we do ask them, they get to do question of the week, which we'll do in just a few minutes here, and we try to involve them as much as we can. One of the things that we don't do often enough are mailbag or question and answer style, Q&A style shows. And these are a way for us to really connect with our listeners and to answer the questions that you really want to have answered. And, we've got this direct line to them via the Patreon. And so I've put up a post on the Patreon. We're going to be working these in more often into our show rotation, just because it just feels like an untapped opportunity that we're not really fully utilizing. And this one is going to be themed. It's a level up Q&A. So we've got a bunch of questions from our listeners about leveling up, and we're going to be talking about that for our main topic today. Before we get into all of that, I want to mention our sponsor, ChannelFireball.com. Please do check them out. If you need Magic stuff, and don't we all, right? I mean, it's part of the deal with playing Magic is that you're going to need cards and singles and sealed products and all that stuff. And you can just go to one place, channelfireball.com. You're going to get fair prices. You're going to get quick shipping. You're going to get great customer service at CFB. And you also get awesome free content. And a lot of it's along the same line as what we're doing here. And it also is a much broader stroke. You're going to find, for example, Reed Duke, maybe you've heard of him. He's got a Legacy Pox video up right now. You can watch him play his Pox deck in Legacy. If you like a lot of different types of Magic, old school or, constructed, Legacy, that kind of stuff, you're going to find videos from some of the best players in the world. Also, Limited. Mike Sigrist, one of the best Limited players out there, has an article titled Team Limited Changed My Life. Ooh, I haven't read that one. I just found it when I was doing prep work for the show, but I can't wait to read that one. And of course, there's awesome content from a whole bunch of other people on channelfireball.com. We do hope you check them out. Also, there's a GP coming up in just a week. And if you're interested in coming, it's not too late. GrandPrixVegas.com to check out all the details for that. And we hope to see you there. Also, I mentioned them earlier, but the Patreon, right? I mean, this is such a cool two-way street because it allows the people that are most invested in the show to support the show directly, which is really great. It's an awesome opportunity, and it's a way to do it that meets the people's budget however they see fit. But also, it gives us an avenue to give back. And one of the things that we like to do on here is the Patreon question of the week. And then we've kind of expanded that out to a full episode here, like I mentioned before. But we're going to start with the Patreon question of the week. This one comes from Chris, who says, ooh, this is a good one. What one feature do you wish was part of Magic Online?
Wow, that's an interesting question, because my first reaction is I can only pick one. But then my second is I actually don't really know what I would pick.
I mean, Leagues was a big deal, right? I mean, you and I were both very pro Leagues.
Yeah. Yes, Leagues was very good, and I'm a huge fan of those. I don't want to ask for this because I know it's actually coming. Vintage Leagues actually would increase the amount I play Magic Online by a non-zero amount.
For sure.
Because I do love Vintage. Maybe this is probably not something that applies to a lot of people, but I kind of wish I could set as a default what kinds of cards it selects when I make my deck. So when I import deck lists, it always it seemingly picks random versions of each card, and I always have to switch them out. I wish I could just pick which lands I wanted to always use, which basics, or which versions of Lightning Bolt I always wanted to use. That I think would be convenient.
Yeah, the one thing that I've wanted for a long time. And I recognize it's a little narrow, but it is something that I think since the data's there, it would be really cool, would be for me to be able to get information about myself, right? Like what's my match win percentage in constructed or limited or booster draft or sealed deck.
Low, probably, but
thank you, Luis. Or be able to narrow that down to what's my match win percentage in Amonkhet draft, right? And or an older
probably more
format.
useful than the thing I was asking for.
I just it's just a geeky thing, and you can get it by doing it other ways. We'll actually touch on that a little bit later in the show. But since Magic Online has all that data, I don't want all of it. Like, I understand that, like, there's something to be said for not, like, breaking down a set so much that you just know, like, this card has a 56% win percentage if first picked in the, whatever. I don't need that much, but about me, like, I do, people love looking at their rating and tracking that, and rating's such a crude tool. I wouldn't mind having a little bit more, as far as that goes. The other thing I'd like is, how Magic Online records your draft picks for you? You may not know this, if you play Magic Online, but there's actually, if you go into the settings in the account settings, you can check a little box and it will record all of your drafts in a text file, just a simple text file. And it'll show the players in the draft and then all the cards that were in each pack and which card you picked. And there's been some, websites, fluey.org is the one that people use now, that have popped up to, where you can upload that text file and then review your draft with images, like with card images, and you can send it to your friends. I mean, I have people send those to me. We use them on the LR subreddit too, where, you can go through somebody's draft and say, okay, well, why did you pick this card here instead of this one? And you can give your opinions and have a discussion about it. I wouldn't mind if that was just built in. That would be really cool just to be able to bring up any of my drafts and just look at them, like basically like a replay of a draft within Magic Online. I think that'd be nice too. Thanks for the question, Chris. We appreciate it. Crack a pack. Let's get into this thing. We've got Amonkhet. This one comes from, it says, with love from Rusty S in Milwaukee. Thank you, Rusty. We love you too. And yes, I do speak for you, by the way, Luis, when it comes to who you love. I will always put myself first. Winged Shepherd.
Not a card I'm interested in first picking. No, it's a fine card.
It's okay, right?
This I have liked better than most of the rest of this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the 3/3 flyer actually feels like it's worth more than just like the 6/4 ground creature or the 5/5 ground creature that you get after like the Desert Ceradon or River Serpent. Yeah,
for sure. And yeah, of course, being cycling 1 certainly has proven to be an important thing. Next is Essence Scatter. Fine card.
Yeah, I like Essence Scatter. I've been impressed with it.
I have too, which is weird because you kind of wouldn't think so with the game being pretty low to the ground in a lot of matchups, but it does seem to pull its weight.
Well, it's just an interactive card on turn 2 that's also fine on like turn 10.
Yeah, that's actually a good way to put it, right? It's just that it is hard to find interactive cards on turn 2, and this is one of them. Desert Ceradon, well, I think you made your opinion clear about that. And I agree. I think it's okay, but very much in the filler kind of D+-ish category at this point. Here's Forsake the Worldly, perhaps my most hated card. Yeah, but it is good. And we talked about it a lot in Sealed last week as well, because boy, it really does serve an important role in Sealed. In fact, I wish there was actually more. I wish there was like a straight up naturalize in the set, for green as well. You often find yourself up against a powerful enchantment and they just didn't put an outlet, in green. But yeah, Forsake the Worldly, exile target artifact or enchantment for 2 and a white and it has cycling. I do think that the draft format is still a bit too hostile to happily main deck it, but if you do end up main decking one, you could do worse.
Yeah.
Ooh, Colossopede.
I wouldn't go Colossopede.
Colossopede.
I'm still on Essence Scatter at this point.
Oh, I'm all about that. Actually, I think I like Essence Scatter too. Doom Dissenter.
It's a playable card.
That's exactly how I describe it. It's playable. It's not to be confused with good. But the two things that it does well is it picks up -1/-1 counters for some value, and then also if you are looking to block, it can block twice, or sometimes there's even zombie synergies. But Evolving Wilds, not first pickable in this format.
Nope.
Ooh, this next one is though. Cartouche of Strength. Can I about Cartouche of Strength?
Yes, you can. Cartouche of Strength is actually a card that you can first pick, and so far is the first pick.
Yeah. Dissenter's Deliverance is next. That's the destroy an artifact with cycling. No. Splendid Agony. This is a card that's certainly had its fair bit of controversy, actually, in the Team Draft Super League, with people valuing it much differently at this stage in the format. Where are you at on Splendid Agony?
I think it's quite good. It's a card I value highly just because it kills a lot of things by itself. It'll also 2-for-1 them a decent amount of the time just because there's a decent amount of 1 toughness creatures because everyone's playing these 2 mana 2/1s and sometimes 1 mana 1/1s. And when you get involved in a combat, you can often win the combat plus have a stray -1/-1 counter to go somewhere else.
See, I actually agree with you 100%. And yet I have gotten pushback on that, that people think it's like run of the mill black common. It's just fine. Like you can put it in your deck, but whatever. But this card to me seems so well positioned because of the way that the format's played out. I tend to value it quite highly. I think it's really good. Like I feel like whenever I have it in my deck, or in my hand, if my opponent, plays a plains or something, I'm feeling okay about it. Not nearly. I'm actually pretty high on Splendid Agony. I like that, and I like Cartouche of Ambition. Although I will say that I would pick Cartouche of Strength over Splendid Agony. Do you agree with that? Or
I like Cartouche of Strength over Splendid Agony.
Sacred Excavation, we had this last time, the 3 and a blue sorcery. Return up to 2 target cards with cycling from your graveyard to your hand to slow, although you seem to think it's like sometimes playable.
I'm not saying this card is good. I just
you love it? You think it's great, A+?
I think in a mono cycling deck it has its place, but that's not a very good deck in general.
Okay, yeah. So you put a bad card in a bad deck. Okay. Honored Crop Captain. So red, white, 3/2, and whenever it attacks other attacking creatures, get +1/+. So gold card, right? It's powerful. It's in one of the more powerful 2 color combos in the set. But I'd never take it first. Like I still just take the Cartouche. Are you with me on that, or do you take the risk?
Cartouche, then I would take Splendid Agony, then I would take Crop Captain out of this pack.
Too much risk?
Yeah, just taking a gold card, especially an aggro gold card. I mean, red white's going to be aggro like 90% of the time, so that's not a big issue. But just taking a gold card over a monocolor card is something that you shouldn't do unless there's a big difference. And I don't even know that Crop Captain's better than Cartouche of Strength. I think it is better than Splendid Agony, though.
I do too. Yeah, I think Cartouche might just be better. All right, this gets interesting because now we've got a little green fight on our hands. Exemplar of Strength, 1 and a green, 4/4, and you put 3 -1/-1 counters on a creature when it enters the battlefield, and whenever it attacks, you can remove a counter from it and gain a life. It's a good little uncommon.
I do think this card is good. I think Cartouche of Strength is better, though.
I do too. The thing about Exemplar of Strength is that the 2 best scenarios for it are, one, when you can dump the counters onto something else in the early game that you don't mind dumping them onto, like the Doom Dissenter that we talked about, or even a 1-drop of some sort, though it'll invariably kill the thing that you're putting it on, so you have to be prepared for that. But I mean, if you're playing like a turn 3 4/4, that is a real problem. I mean, that card can really hammer. The other side, when it's been good for me, has been in green white primarily, where you're really prioritizing a lot of combat tricks and running a lot of combat tricks. And that means that you can just attack with your Exemplar, make it into a 2/2, gain your life. Your opponent is highly incentivized to block it because it doesn't get any better than that. And then if you can use a combat trick to save it, the next time it attacks as a 3/3, it's very likely to just be able to attack freely anyway. And it kind of snowballs from there. We compared it to Longtusk Cub, and it does have that feel as long as you can back it up. That's the key. You need to be able to.
The high end is not as good, unfortunately.
That's very true.
It has some good nut draws, though. When you put all the counters onto like a Doom Dissenter on turn 3, all of a sudden you have a 4/4 on turn 3. That's a pretty big game.
Yeah, for sure. I like the card a lot, but I think as a consistent performer, the Cartouche of Strength is gonna be more valuable overall. Good rare too, though. Plague Belcher, 2 and a black for a 5/4 zombie beast with menace. When it enters the battlefield, you put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature you control, and whenever another zombie you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. This is a good little rare.
It is a good rare. It's especially good in zombie decks, even though it's playable in like the black-green counter deck without zombies. It's also just playable by itself. It's a 3 mana 3/2 menace with slight upside.
Yes.
I think I just take Cartouche of Strength, though.
God, this is a close one. This is really close. It is between these two for me, by the way.
It is close, but just a removal spell that comes with +1/+1 and trample, I think, is better than the 3/2 menace. Like this can be a glorified Cursed Minotaur a lot of games, even though it has upside above that.
That is very true. That happens a lot. Man, I need to see that timer turn red before I can make this pick. Like, I think that the conservative side of me wants to just take the Cartouche, just because it's so consistently good, and it's also just overpowered, right? I mean, what the hell, 3 mana? Like, we had that reaction when we first saw it. Like, wait a second, this is just better than Hunt the Weak in many ways, and it costs a full mana less. Like, what is even what is even happening here? I'll take the Plague Belcher. Screw it. Let's get sideways.
All right. That's fine with me. I'll take a Cartouche of Strength.
All right. Well, apparently I'm passing one to you as well. Okay. So that's it for our Crack-A-Pack. Let's move into our main topic. So again, the question that we put forth was questions about leveling up, right? I mean, at the core of limited resources, we're all about leveling up, right? I mean, that's the key. Sometimes leveling up comes in the form of strategic discussion that we'll have where we often will label it as a level up show. But also it also comes in the form of understanding the format intimately, being up on the format, and we'll talk about Amonkhet, or whatever the current set is pretty often on the show as well by means of keeping you updated and stuff, because that also keeps you at a high level. But, these questions are going to be not about that. These questions are going to be about that first category where you're really looking to improve your game on a kind of fundamental level that you can carry over from set to set. So let's get into some of these questions here, Luis. We've got a bunch of them. Probably not going to get through all of them, but I'm going to save any of the ones that we didn't use, and I'm going to put them in a document. And then the next time we want to do a show like this, we'll have those, and I can ask another on the Patreon as well. So this one comes from Isfan, who says, "Hi guys, can you please talk more about how the other cards in the first pack might affect your first pick? The other day when you guys cracked a pack with Ben Stark, you opened 2 rares, Vizier of Many Faces and Regal Caracal. And then you proceeded to discuss how if the rest of the pack would have more blue spells, then you would have picked Regal Caracal, but since it had more white spells, you'd choose Vizier. Can you please explain this concept a bit deeper? When and why does the contents of the first pack affect your first pick? Thanks."
Well, the first thing I want to caution is it's a tiebreaker more than a huge difference. Like if we're looking at Vizier of Many Faces versus like Electrify, there's no number of blue cards in the pack that are going to make me want to take Electrify, just because it's just so much worse than Vizier. But it turns out that Vizier of Many Faces and Regal Caracal are pretty close.
Yeah, I think they are. I think Vizier's a little better, but anyway, that's a separate discussion.
It is a little better, but blue's a little worse.
There you go.
So, but we said that if the pack had too many blue cards, you take the white card and vice versa. So what you're trying to figure out is what the next couple people are going to take. And if you open a pack, like using this one, for example, where the next pick is likely to be like, there's a Cast Out and a Gustwalker as the next best cards. If you take the Caracal, the next person's probably going to take Vizier or Gustwalker or Cast Out, depending on what their first pick was. Like if they first picked a white card, they might just take another white card. But the 2 people after that are almost assuredly going to take the 2 white cards if the first pick was Vizier. And you're setting yourself up, no matter which order those 3 cards go in, to have 2 white drafters, at least potential white drafters, on your left. And that makes your pack 2 a lot worse. It's not always going to happen like that. And if sometimes you'll take Regal Caracal over Gustwalker, and then just cut white so hard the person abandons Gustwalker. But sometimes that person just knows white is cut and just takes white in pack 2 anyway. And
sometimes that person is you.
Yes, exactly. And you don't want to give them that incentive. And if you were to take the only blue card out of a pack with 3 good white cards, you're going to set yourself up much, much better in pack 2. So the risk here, and the one thing I really want to avoid, I mean, this is a great question, but the thing I really want to avoid is people hearing this and then all of a sudden, taking a Splendid Agony out of a pack with these cards in it because there's too many blue cards or too many white cards. And you can't take that much of a power level hit. This is a tiebreaker between 2 like A-level cards.
Yeah. And that is, it also touches on a fundamental skill, I think that our listeners are particularly good at because we talk about it, but that is really, really important to getting better at things like this, which is the ability to see gray area, to see things from 0 to 100 rather than 100 or 0. You can hear Luis say what he just said about this. And if you take that to the extreme, if you just take it at face value and just say, okay, well, Luis said I shouldn't pass, I shouldn't take the card with the same colors and pass, that's not what he's saying, right? He's saying that there's a gradient here and that you need to be able to apply that gradient to understand what's the delta between these 2 cards and how much does the other cards in the pack affect how much I'm going to pick it. Now that's a skill. I mean, that's just something that, you're going to have your own solid card evaluations in. You can use ours as a guideline and then sort of adjust as you work your way through. But if you don't think Vizier of Many Faces is very good, or you just think blue is terrible and you're very adamant about that, then that might change the way that you approach this thing. But all of this requires some subtlety, some nuance. And if you don't have that skill, you have to get it. You will never really reach full potential at anything, let alone Magic, if you don't have the ability to see the in-between and just take these as like hard and fast rules or black and white situations. Thank you, Isvan, for the question. That was a very good question. And I'm sure one a lot has. We've covered signals and such on the show before, and I'm sure that we will again, but this was a nice little touch on that. James says, you guys have said on a number of occasions that one of the best ways to improve is to play and play and play and play some more. And Lord knows I'm taking that advice. What I would love to do is leverage those reps just a little bit more by adding some kind of data gathering, self-feedback process to my play. He says, the idea is to be able to more easily recognize my own biases and tendencies, and maybe even understand which tendencies and biases are helping and which are hurting. Do you guys have any processes you use to try to scoop up this kind of information? Do you know anyone else in the world of Magic that has processes like this? So I do. I don't do it myself, but I have before, and I certainly know people that do it. Zach, longtime listener to the show, had a spreadsheet going for a really long time that was really good. And a lot of people do. What I would recommend is keeping it simple, James. Do basic tracking of your results. This can actually help a lot. It just keeps you in touch with what's going on. So the type of thing that you'd want to do is something simple, like a spreadsheet that has the format, what colors of deck you played for that draft, what type of an event it was, maybe what your record was, so did you go 2-1, 3-0, that kind of thing. What type of deck it was, if you want to categorize it as an aggro curve out style deck or a slower deck or a mid-range deck or whatever, that's optional. But, if you feel like you're pretty consistent with that, that can help you get some more data. And then maybe some notes about how your games actually played out. This is an important thing, because if you put together a really great deck, it's red white, it's beat down, and by all measures it's very, very good, but you end up mulliganing to 5 in a bunch of your games and don't really play any, it's important to note that it could unveil something about the way that the deck is constructed, that it has to mulligan too much or you're not playing enough lands or whatever. But it also could just be that you just got unlucky and mulliganed, and you don't necessarily want to have that data. You don't want to look at that data and be like, well, red white sucks because I went 1-2 or 0-3 with this deck. So that kind of stuff is important. The thing that I would focus on is making the data usable for you, because the truth is, let's just be honest here, right? You're never going to get the sample size that actually matters. You're never going to actually crack a format by booster drafting yourself and tracking the results. You can start to see some trends, but you're going to be relying on your own interpretation and extrapolation of that data a lot. And that's okay. That's a skill set that you can have. I mean, this is what the pro players do when they lead up to the pro tour, and they're able to get a decent sample size because they have a whole team of players drafting and contributing to these data sets. But the truth is that you should be able to interpret these things in a reasonable way and draw reasonable conclusions from them that will help you improve, even if they're not statistically conclusive. Luis, when it does come time for pro tour testing and stuff, this is a similar method to what most of the teams use that you know of, right? Like the sort of basic tracking and discussing and stuff.
Not all teams do this. So some are a little bit more based on feel than others. But I would say that keeping track of results is both useful and dangerous. And you touched on the dangerous part, which is you're just not going to have enough sample size. So if you're like, well, I drafted red white 4 times and I won 40% of my matches, red white is bad, like that's not a good conclusion. We know red white is great. But if you get enough of a sample size, and part of the way you can do that is have other people contribute. Part of the way that you can do this in a way that's useful is just track your results just to see how you're generally improving without worrying. Like, I would probably try to reduce the number of types of data you collect, because reducing transaction costs also makes you more likely to comply and actually write down the data.
For sure.
I'm a huge fan in not trying to figure out the optimal, but trying to figure out what you'll actually do. This has to do with tracking your draft data. This has to do with, your exercise program, how you eat, any of those things.
Podcasting.
Like one of the things you always harp on when people ask you about a podcast is like, don't worry about anything except just doing it every week. Don't worry about having the perfect equipment. Don't worry about having a really strict outline for the show. Just keep putting the show out. And yeah, you want to improve, but it's the same when it comes to all these things. And I think data is a big part of it. Is I bet most people who like, all right, I'm going to track data. So I'm going to do, format, colors, win or what my record was, what happened, like maybe a column for like notes and like all this stuff. And I think what'll happen is after a while, you're just going to stop putting stuff in because at some point you're like, oh, I just lost. I don't feel like adding this. And then you're like, well, I didn't add it last time. So therefore I'm not going to again.
Oh yeah. Oh boy. I think we've all fallen for that, haven't we? I've done that too.
I haven't because I've never tracked my data, but
God.
Well, I don't say that because I think it's useless. I say that because I learn a lot more intuitively and I get enough reps that I can draw conclusions, but not enough that I need to actually know what my literal win percentage is.
Yeah. You also have access to people, that can help you parse that data and figure it out and bounce ideas off of, where some of our listeners don't. I mean, they can't just call up Ben Stark and be like, hey, Ben, do you think red white's good? Or,
Yeah, but you can tweet at him. He's not gotten sick of answering things.
That is true. That is true. Maybe Ben wasn't the best example, but yeah.
And so if you wanted to track your data, what I think would be the best in terms of getting something out of it is really just track your matches played and your win percentage and by format. So you can just see how different you do in different formats. And especially if you do it sequentially, you can kind of see like, wow, I lost a bunch, but then I started winning. What happened maybe? And, get a little bit of information that way without dwelling too much on it, because I don't think going overboard on data collection is actually going to pay dividends for most people. I just don't think it's that useful. I think you can get something out of it, but I think people overestimate how much they can get out of it.
Yeah, I think look, I've got other things to add here that reinforce that point, Luis, which is I like using screenshots, for example, of difficult situations or difficult draft picks to send to my friends via message. That we're also connected these days, that it's easy to disseminate this information and say, hey, what would you take here? You can put it on Twitter. You can put it on the LR subreddit. You can ask your friends, that kind of thing. Fluid.org, I mentioned earlier, is a place where you can upload your Magic Online drafts if you're a Magic Online player and share them so that other people can give you feedback on them. You can use replays in Magic Online, or just record your own screen and then watch your own games back. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But these are all ways that are not statistically relevant. Sending one screenshot of one pick or watching one match or one game on a replay isn't something that you're really data gathering on, but it does give you immediate feedback and it does give you a snapshot of some of the ideas and the things that are going on in your head that you can really learn from. I mean, if you have a trusted friend who is good at limited and you send them a screenshot of a draft pick and it says, I was stuck here, what should I take? And they go, what? Of course you just take the Cartouche here. Like that's not a close pick, right? You shouldn't be arguing over, Cartouche versus blank, right? Whatever, some mediocre, like Corey Holler, right? And you're just like, I really like Corey Holler. And maybe this person's played more and they're just like, no. You really want the green Cartouche over the Corey Holler. And now you can make up that ground in just one step. And again, these are more anecdotal ways to go about it, but they're all ways that you can gather information about what you're doing and use it to actively try to get better. This is a pretty good one. Jeff Stumpo says, when you level up and you know it, what sound effect goes off in your head? Is it like Mario coin or Zelda item? Yeah. Or F yeah, bald eagle screech was the one he said.
It's more like the Final Fantasy.
Oh man, I remember that too. I'm going to go with Mario coin. Like definitely I'm like, yeah. Thanks Jeff for that one. And let us know what you guys for that one too. I thought that was a great question. Odin Egan says, hi. I felt like I'd really reached a milestone during Shadows over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon. I was regularly going 3-0 at FNM and was doing pretty good online too. However, I started doing horrible immediately when Kaladesh came out and it became difficult to stay motivated as well as more expensive to get the games in. How much do you think the current set means as to how much you're doing well at a given time? How and how can I best keep progressing from set to set? Was I really just a one-hit wonder for Shadows over Innistrad? Great question, Odin. I think that you're not alone. I think a lot of people find themselves having these issues. And I think that one of the things that pops up as a result of this is that a lot of people, while they're still on the upswing to learn, right? Look, what does the perfect draft robot look like? It looks like somebody who does not care about preference, right? They don't like to play a certain type of deck, or they don't have an affinity for certain types of cards and not like other types of cards or colors or strategies or whatever. But the problem is, of course, none of us are that person. We all have inherent biases. And I think that some sets just line up better with certain people, and then certain sets don't, right? And also you're forced to adjust, right? You, especially if it doesn't line up, there's a long adjustment period where a lot of people don't want to accept their new reality that this set is very fast or very slow, or that, blue sucks in this set or whatever it is. And so they'll eventually start to reach out into other strategies, but that can take a really long time. And some people just will go a whole set without ever really fully developing it. What thoughts do you have for Odin here, Luis, about, getting stuck in a format?
It's tough because I've gotten stuck in formats before. When I remember original Zendikar came out, I could not buy a match win in the last half of that pro season. I actually remember like bricking every GP and every PT based on that limited format. I just did routinely went 2-4 in the drafts at the pro tours and, 1-5 at a Grand Prix. Sometimes you hit a format that you really just don't get. It never clicks for you. And the way Magic works is by the time it does, sometimes it's just over, right? Especially when you look at something like Ether Revolt. Ether Revolt, it just didn't last that long. Because it's a small set, combined with the big set, and all of a sudden, you're not going to draft it 30 times. So part of it is if you notice you're losing a lot, thanks to your spreadsheet, your extremely detailed one, then you can go ahead and kind of try to figure out what that is. Especially one thing I noticed is people are very biased by the format they just played, especially if they were succeeding in it. So if you were doing really well in, Shadows, Eldritch Moon, and then Kaladesh comes out, you're probably going to have some carryover from what worked well before because that's what you just won a ton with. And especially when those things aren't compatible, then you could end up in trouble. It's hard to recalibrate when you have something off, but identifying that you're off is the first part, and that's the hardest part.
Mm-hmm. I see that.
I'm trying to think of what a good takeaway here is. Part of it is assume you know nothing about the format. Go back to ground zero. Try to eliminate most of your preconceptions and just look at draft videos or draft articles and just see, because when you go to a website like Channel Fireball and you see Mike Sigrist break down one of his drafts, he did a draft article. So even if you don't like videos, you could look at his article. And I remember looking at this because I don't really watch videos, but looking at his article, he talked about why he picked each card. Even that is very instrumental. Even if it's to see that he didn't even mention two cards you thought of, and it's wow, he didn't even think those cards were worth mentioning. That is a real big signal. Right. So you can see how far off you are from at least what that person thinks. I'm not saying what they think is correct, but getting access to other perspectives, especially presumably people who do a decent amount of winning, is very useful.
One of the other traps that I see all the time, didn't make the top 10 limited traps, but it's definitely a thing, is when the set first comes out. It
wasn't as big as Lovable Trap.
Yeah. You're successful, right? When the first set comes out, you're I'm going to go to the pre-release, and you're wow, I 4-1'd, or I won my pre-release or whatever. And then the set comes out on Magic Online, or you get together with your friends or at the local shop and you draft a few times and you're wow, I'm winning. And you forget that when the set first comes out, there's a whole lot of players that don't play nearly as much as you do that come out to try out the new set for a week or two, and then they disappear again until the new set comes out. They're kind of these cyclical players who really enjoy it when a set's brand new and fresh, and they like to get their hands on some cards, but that's kind of the end of it for them, and there's a large group of players. I can tell you, looking at the download numbers for our set review shows, that there are a lot of people like that kind of focus around their Magic enjoyment around the pre-release and the release weekends and a little bit after that. But I think that can also throw your head off a little, where you're new set, exciting. You have your preconceived notions about it. You listen to the set review, you kind of get yourself ready to go. You go smash some pre-releases and you think, okay, I'm doing it, this is good. And then you kind of hit that stretch after it's been out for a few weeks where the format really starts to settle, where the truth starts to come out about what's good and what's not in the format, and where you can't just get away with stuff because people start really, narrowing down which the good cards are, and some of the less experienced players stop playing as much. And now you've got it in your head that you're good at this format, but really you're just starting to put the work in on getting good at it, and you may be stuck already. You maybe already had made some conclusions that were incorrect and that you were just skating by on because you were playing against players that were worse than you. So I really like what you said, Luis, about making sure that you kind of ground zero that. And I wouldn't even hate, applying, at least partially, some of that to after the pre-release. You obviously you have something to work from. You've put in work reading and listening to podcasts and stuff, so you don't want to scrap all of that. But really try to come from a clean slate from that point. I think it'll help you out. Okay, next one comes from Kyle Morton, who says, I've been consistently winning game ones during F&M lately, but equally consistently fail with the sideboarding plan. Bad sideboards aside, he says it may be part of the issue, but let's just assume it's not for the case, for this question. How do you gauge your sideboard needs, and when do you choose to not sideboard? So this is a good opportunity for us to touch on sideboarding.
Definitely a good opportunity to touch on sideboarding. The first thing I'll probably say is that Kyle's losing has nothing to do with sideboarding. It's just small sample size. I would bet any amount on that. And that's not to say this is a bad question or we can't talk about sideboarding, because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about there. Mm-hmm. But Kyle's not playing enough games that there's going to be such a big difference between game one and game two. It just so happens that they're losing their post-board games. So I do want to watch out for misattribution, because I think there's some of that going on here.
Good. Yeah, that's really good to point out.
I mean, it's just like you didn't play 80 matches at F&M, and therefore, even if you are 60% in your game ones, you're not 45% in your post board games, just because it doesn't swing that much. It swings by a couple percent at most. So you just kind of maybe got unlucky more often in games 2 and 3.
Sure.
But as for what you can do during sideboarding, there's two important things to figure out: what you don't want in your deck and what you do want in your deck from your sideboard. Since the first thing is the most obvious thing is, and this is where most people, largely succeed. They look at their sideboard and they're like, what cards would be good against my opponent? Aha, I have Blazing Volley because I saw 3/1 toughness creatures in game 1. Or I have a Forsake the Worldly, which I didn't main deck even though it has cycling, because they have Sandworm Convergence and Cast Out. What people do less frequently is look at their game 1 cards and decide what just needs to not be in the deck. And, if you saw 2 Cartouche of Ambition, the black Cartouche, and you only have 2 1 toughness creatures, you really can't have those in your deck. Like you need to get those out. And most people are not going to think quite in that way. So you really want to look at what cards in your main deck match up poorly against your opponents. And that's as simple as the case. Even if there's nothing screaming to be brought in, I'll take out my 2/1 and my 3/1 and put in just some random 2/2s.
Yep.
And that's just going to line up better.
To accentuate that point further, like I would actually advise, instead of picking up your deck box and starting to look through your sideboard options first, try just picking up your deck and look at which cards are bad first. Like make that a priority, because like you said, that's the thing that people overlook, right? That's the weak spot. That's the part where people just don't consider that until they're going to try to bring something in. But you may not have a silver bullet style card to bring in, and you very well may be incentivized to take a card out, like in the example that you gave, Luis. But one of the ways to really kind of make that, because you're going to do both of these things, but since the weakness comes from forgetting or just not being aware of which cards you don't want in your deck anymore, look there first. Just go ahead and just go through and be like, I've got this 7 mana spell, 4/4 flying, indestructible, and my opponent's playing a low to the ground aggro deck. I can't afford to have this card in my deck. I just can't. So I'm going to make sure that I take that out and replace it with basically any creature that I can play on turns 1, 2, or 3. Like this is a reasonable way to get yourself in that mindset of not only thinking about what I'm going to bring in, but what I need to bring out as well.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. The way that I looked at it too, Luis, was I have kind of two goals, I suppose, when I think about sideboarding. One of them is to bring in those silver bullet style sideboard cards. These are more obvious. These are the cards that are specifically designed to take out certain types of permanents or threats or whatever. And if your opponent has critical mass of those that you think it's worth it to bring it in, you're clearly going to want those. Cards like Stinging Shot and stuff like that, where if your opponent shows you a bunch of flyers and you've got one of those in your sideboard, it's going to be one of your better cards, so you're going to want to bring it in. So those ones are pretty straightforward. I think most people understand that side of it. The question is taking it one step further as well, which is adjusting your deck's game plan at a fundamental level to better react to your opponent. This goes sort of hand in hand with which cards you want to take out of your deck. But it can even be as simple as bringing in cards like Festering Mummy against the hyper aggro decks or something like that, where you are looking at it like, well, I'm this kind of big game ramp deck, but I've got a lot of expensive cards and I might be dead before that happens. So I'm going to actually take out one or two of those and kind of hedge, because, a good way to look at it is like, let's say you have 2 7-drop payoff cards in your green ramp deck. If you open up your 7, to start the game and those 2 cards are in it against an aggressive deck, you're in big trouble. Like you've, almost mulled to 5 and if your opponent has a good curve out. So you're going to want to make sure that you try to hedge that and, not let that happen quite as often. A similar example just on the other end of the spectrum is sometimes you get into a fight where it's like, I need the most late game punch I can possibly get because my opponent is able to go toe for toe with my main game plan, and these games are going to go long. And you're like, I've got a greater sandworm sitting in my sideboard that I just didn't quite have room for, or cut something else over.
Cancel, ready to go.
Yeah, cancel, right? And you bring those cards in. And even though those aren't typically the type of cards that you think of when you're like, oh, great sideboard card, greater sandworm and cancel. These aren't really the ones that jump to mind, but this is how you can adjust your game plan and maybe take out something like a more aggressive 2-drop that realistically isn't going to get the job done against this type of opponent. The other thing is there's a few other exceptions that pop up. You can completely change one or both of your colors, though this is far more common in sealed deck where, it's more possible to have this. It doesn't happen in draft very often, but this is one of the things that you should keep in mind, specifically in sealed, is that sometimes you just have a much different deck that you can present and you want that opportunity, for you. And then also, this is a more subtle version, is some people like to sideboard out cards that they either like or dislike on the draw or on the play, like depending on which one of those are, like, maybe like Censor or something like that. Do you do much of that, by the way? I wanted to ask you about that, Luis. Do you sideboard out cards in limited for whether you're on the play or the draw much?
I do. I definitely do that. I don't know if I do it much. It's like a combination of player draw and the matchup. So it's not just I automatically do something on the player draw, but it's also if that lines up with the given matchup and what cards are in my opponent's deck. So it's hard to have like a hard and fast rule, but there are definitely examples of when you might want to do this. I guess it depends more on like what interactions you expect. Like counterspells are a good example where there are some matchups where counterspells are just like a little bit better on the play than they would be on the draw. But for the most part, I think that it's just mostly what the matchup looks like more than who's going first or second.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I think that the way to frame it is that this is just like another metric that you can apply to whether you want to put a card in or not, and maybe not just the only one. Thank you, Kyle, for that excellent question. This next one comes from Farhan, who says, Hi, Marshall and Luis. I have recently started recording my draft games on Magic Online to share them with my friends. How good as a tool do you find it to rewatch your own plays? Oh boy, Farhan, you're in for a ride. It's so good. It really, like, when it comes to gameplay, it is unbelievable. Like, I think it's the best thing you can do. I think the best possible thing you can do is to have somebody much better than you sit down with you and do this. But I'm telling you, even if you don't have access to somebody like that, that's fine. Because when you watch yourself play, it is crazy. The first time you do it, it just straight up feels like you're watching somebody else play. And you're just thinking to yourself, who's this idiot? Why is he attacking here? Like, that's oh God, that's me. Like, I did that in a game of Magic. And it really starts to peel the layers back on how your brain thinks differently when you're simply observing a game of Magic versus when you're in it, right? When you're playing it and you're maybe even like emotionally invested on some level, and you're sort of dealing with the accumulation of the game as a whole. And what I mean by that is, humans are certainly fallible, right? And one of the things that you'll see all the time, Luis, I'm sure you've seen this 100 times, is when one player gets off to a quick start, but the other player stabilizes, but still feels like they're behind or like they need to be conservative, even though if you just snapshot the board, it's like you're way ahead. Like you're at 14, you got a 5/5, and you're just like, go, because you want to try to block their Nefcrop Entangler or something because, they went 1, 2, 3 on the play, and you got a little bit, kind of on your back heels about it. And you'll see those things pop up with yourself too, where you're just like, man, I totally should have attacked here. Like I just wasn't thinking, and I just should have shipped my guy in, and I just didn't because I was scared, basically. Like, cause I was like, I thought I was behind, and I just didn't bother to realize until the next turn that I no longer was. I think this is one of the best things you can possibly do, Ferran, and I highly recommend it. It's hard. It is hard. I mean, your ego, we try to preach on here to leave your ego aside when it comes to improving at these things, because it really does just get in the way. But man, it's hard to watch yourself just be awful. And I'll tell you what, when you're getting better and coming up, you will see so many mistakes that you just didn't know you made in real time. And it just makes you feel bad. You just feel like, oh, I've come so far and this is still the stuff I'm doing. But try not to be too hard on yourself and try to stick to it. And if you can, I'm telling you, you're going to get better as a result of doing this. It is, I highly, highly recommend it if you want to try to dissect your games. I know you still do this all the time, right, Luis? Just record your games and watch them.
I actually do watch some of the games. Come on,
you do not.
I actually do. I tend to watch the games from the Pro Tour that I'm involved in.
Oh, you watch your coverage games. Okay. Well, yeah. I wasn't thinking of that. That's kind of cool. Do you ever see yourself make mistakes and go, what am I doing? Or have you, and be honest, I mean, because.
Oh, I definitely have seen things and wondered why I did them at the time. Or, I will be honest and say I don't make that many mistakes when I play, but
yeah,
I also
especially
do.
At the PT, where you're really dialed in there.
I certainly hope so, but I also do still make mistakes, and sometimes I look at games or look at like hands. I'm like, why did I keep this hand?
Mm-hmm.
And it's useful. Plus, it's interesting to see, well, in this particular case, this is maybe a little unique, what the commentators say about what's going on. So
that part's really interesting too, especially when you get to, from a commentator's perspective. I've had a chance to sit down with you and a few other players and go over some of their matches as it went. And some of them I was even in the booth for. And it's incredible the level of depth that you can get from the actual player versus just watching it from the outside. And I feel that same way, because I've of course gone back and looked at the games that I've had on camera to see what you guys said. And it was the same thing. It was just like, oh, well, this is, I was thinking, you guys happened to pick up on basically everything I was thinking, which I was really impressed by. But still, when you're actually playing the game, you're definitely thinking of things that the commentators don't. But anyway, Ferran, do it. Record them, sit down. Grit your teeth and do
it. You should do to every single game, but I think a mix, you still want to play, like you want to balance, because we assume you have a budget of time. You want to balance playing games and looking at things, but I think doing both is probably better than doing any one in too high of a percentage.
Yeah, the other thing I think that this evolves into because of time constraints are what I mentioned earlier with the screenshots, right? You take a screenshot and I say, hey, Luis, here's the rough situation. I'm red-black with these cards left in my deck. It's game 1. Would you attack here or not? And while Luis maybe won't be able to give me like a fully fleshed out version because he doesn't know every single piece of information, he's going to be able to tell me what his instinct is and why. And that helps me out a lot without imposing, right? Like it's like, okay, take 2 minutes to take a look at this. If somebody's your friend, they're going to take the 2 minutes. If I send Luis a whole draft match of mine and say, hey, watch this 38-minute thing and tell me if I did anything wrong, that's just rude, right? Like that's just not being respectful of your friend's time. So be careful with that. But a screenshot's a good version of this too.
I think the Twitter mentality is actually, I think, pretty good. If you can fit it in a tweet, then without like linking to a new post or something like that, then you're in probably pretty good shape in terms of what you're asking of someone's time.
Yeah,
If someone asks me, hey, like someone asked me like literally today, like, hey, pick one, pack one. Would you take Cast Outer Magma Spray? I'm like, spray. The format's really fast.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. That's great. If they said, hey, how would you build the seal deck? I would probably just not respond.
Right, because it's just you have too much stuff going on to do that. Next question comes from Will Henson, who says, hey, guys, I'd love to see a full review of when you have priority and when you don't. He says, that confuses me. And I know a lot of players are confused about the steps and phases in Magic. And I wanted to put this here as more of a placeholder. We will do that. We will revisit that topic, which we've done before. You can find it in the archives. But I want to kind of reframe it a little bit and touch on it again just for, to make sure that we're keeping up with our audience and stuff. We will go through that specifically for combat, but the rest of it too. In a future episode, but we're not going to do it in this one because it's just going to take too long and we want to get to more of the questions. But Will, I really like the question, and I promise we will do a phases, steps, and how they work, and really dive deep onto those so that you'll have a better understanding on a future show. Ben Fraser says, as a general rule, it's best to develop your board, but what are some of the examples of times you'd rather hold up mana for instants or abilities, and how do you find that distinction? Broad question here, Luis. This isn't the type of thing that you can just throw a base level answer at because every situation is different, but we can address it, right? Because I agree with Ben that it is better to develop your board as a general rule. One of some of the times that you wouldn't do that, and why?
So one of the big ones is if you have a counterspell in your hand and you know that they have a really good card at a certain mana point, like that they have Glorybringer. So when you're passing to their turn 5, you're almost always rather leave up Cancel or Essence Scatter or even like Electrify rather than playing another creature, because if they have a Glorybringer, you're probably just dead.
Yeah, like the effect that card has on the game is so profound that you may just have lost on the spot.
Right. And then dialing deeper into counterspells, one of the best times to leave up a counter is when you're either like at parity or ahead on board and you have a counterspell. Frequently, it's just going to be better to play a counter than
to develop your board.
Than to develop your board more, because unless the card you're playing is great, you're going to have a decent option of countering something that they have, and that will, especially if you're already ahead, you don't need to get a little more ahead. You want to make sure you don't fall behind. So rather than add another 3/3, you'd rather counter maybe they're 5/5. Another good heuristic is develop your board and then when you're done doing that, then play your card draw spell. So like, the general rule, like you have let's say a 5 mana draw 3, right? Generic card draw spell. You want to play that as like, near the last card in your hand. You'd almost always rather just play more spells, then play that to refill. The times when that changes are the ones that are harder to identify. And that is when you need to find something specific, or you're losing on board, or when the card you're going to play is not going to impact the board all that severely.
Yeah, that's a really, really that one comes up all the time in decks like that. Another sort of shortcut heuristic, like you said, is that comes up, and it especially works against it doesn't work as well against really good players, but against like mid to low level players, it's very good. Is an example where, let's say you play on turn 3, you play a 2/4 and you say go, and your opponent has a 2/2 and they go, and you're tapped out and they go attack you, right? If you look down at your hand and you have a removal spell or a pump spell or something like that, it's often correct to take the 2 damage, let them do what they're going to do, and then pass the turn back after the next turn if you think your opponent's going to just attack into you again. Because if you can leave that up in response, you can set yourself up for getting a really nice 2-for-1. Now, the downside to it is very real. So if you think your opponent is going to look at you and go, why do you have 3 or 4 mana untapped and 4 cards in hand and you didn't do anything? I'm just not going to attack this time. Then you won't have the luxury of making that play. But there's many players in this world. And, for those of you that play at the local card shop all the time, there's always that one person who just attacks all the time, no matter what. They don't care about how many cards you have or what mana. That would be a time when you may want to try to set up that play. The best case scenario for those is when you have a backup plan, where if your opponent doesn't go for it, you still have somewhere to put your mana. That's kind of the dream. That really incentivizes you to try to make that type of play.
And this is why instants combine so well with each other. One of the best combos with Jace's Ingenuity is Cancel, because that's a 5 minute draw 3 that at instant speed is you leave up mana for both. If your opponent plays something that you need to cancel, you cancel it. If you don't, you cast Jace's Ingenuity, and that's just great.
Yeah, and you see that in the current set in Amonkhet with cycling a lot as well. Right, you leave up some type of instant. Your opponent doesn't present you a great opportunity to use it, and you'll use your mana to just cycle some expensive card you didn't want anyway. Lots, by the way, Ben, lots and lots of places where that pops up. So, really keep your eye out for those. There's no one way for us to break it down for you, but you should always be aware of your full options there. All right. Next, we've got one from Sarah Lynn who says, I know you all have touched on this before, but sequencing removal can be a problem for me, especially when playing game 1. A breakdown of when to save cheap, powerful removal like Cut to Ribbons for high-value targets and when to deploy them early to get into damage would be helpful. What do you think about this, Louisa? Each situation is, of course, independent and will need to be adjusted accordingly. But the way I look at these situations are I try to think of my overall game plan and my path to victory, right? If you have 2 2/2s and your opponent has a 2/4, let's just say that that's the board state, and you have cut, that's 1 in a red does 4 damage to a creature, and they're at 20, it's unlikely that using cut to kill their 2/4 and therefore use up your mana for the turn and attacking for 4 is going to lead to me winning the game, right? It is a tough sell to think that taking them from 20 to 16 and not developing my board out to kill their 2/4 is the way that I'm going to actually win the game. And if that's the situation, then I may want to just save it in my hand and try to use it for something a little bit later down the line that might kill me, or a situation that pops up where it's more advantageous. But if I can apply massive pressure to my opponent and say, they're at 6 and I have a cut, I can kill that creature, put them to 4. I'm much more, or put them to 2. I'm much more likely to take that risk and use a good removal spell on something like that. That's in an aggressive deck. In a less aggressive deck, your priorities completely change, where a lot of times these decks are trying to make the game go as long as possible. Your whole game plan is, I want to get to 7 or 8 mana. I want to cast all these card draw spells, and I want to just overwhelm my opponent late. If you're sitting there and staring down a final reward, you have to be very careful about when you use it, because if you use it on something that you otherwise could have answered or could have dealt with in a different way, and they play a card that you can't, that was the game. That easily could cost you the game on the spot. So you really have to try to leverage your cards in different ways. The most common way that this pops up is creatures blocking, right? If my opponent has a ground creature that I can throw a double block on or a triple block or something, I'm much more reluctant to use my removal on it if I think that I can deal with it with my creatures, and I'll try to use my removal on the cards that they have that I can't deal with, through combat.
So I think that that is generally true. These heuristics you're talking about in Amonkhet, it's a little different. You kind of just have to use your removal, as your mana dictates, and you have to use it pretty quickly because everything is just so big and threatening. Mm-hmm. You have a lot less room to save things or try to tailor your removal because the games are so much faster and the threats are so much better, that if they play a 2-drop on the play and you have Cut to Ribbons in your hand and no other 2-drop, you're like 90% that supposed to just cast it. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't, you're just going to fall too far behind. I don't actually like that as a feature of the format. I think that it takes away some amount of options. So I think that it is just a feature that you just have to adjust to. There are some formats, like a sealed is more like this, where you're like, I can't use Cut to Ribbons on their 2-drop because I know that they have a 4/4 flyer in their deck that I have a very hard time beating. In draft, it's like, oh, they played a Nefcrop Entangler on the play, and I'm on the draw and have this as my only 2-drop. Yep, better kill it. And right. Yep. That's just going to end up how it is a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think one way that you can think about it is to just try to imagine what the next few turns look like for both you and your opponent, and look at it from the perspective of if they had reasonable plays over the next 2 turns, right? You don't plan for your opponent, curving Vizier of Many Faces into Glorybringer, but you also don't assume that they're just going to go, land, go, right? You want to pick something in the middle where, let's say, if they're playing, red, green, or whatever, that they played like Hyena Pack into Colossopede, right? Something like that, where it's like two commons that are kind of at or maybe even a little bit below replacement level. And you look at it and say, what will the board look like if they play one or both of those type of cards, that level of card? It doesn't have to be those specifics because that's not really useful. It's just assume they're going to use up their mana on something. If they do that and you make this removal spell play, where does that leave you? And that's a really sort of clarifying answer, I think, in a lot of ways, where, again, it discourages you from using a removal spell to get in for temporary damage that you can't push through for later, because then you could find yourself in real trouble. So, try really to do that. I mean, people talk about imagining games multiple steps ahead, but in Magic, it can get so abstract because there's so many different options. They could miss land drops. They could, you just have no idea. So I think a good baseline is to try to just assume that they're going to play a couple of commons or whatever, and just use that as where would that leave me roughly if they did that? And that, again, can give you a sense for what they're doing rather than, being super specific. All right, next question comes from Tyler, who says, you guys have touched on level 1, 2, and 3 plays before, but it'd be cool if you went more in depth on reading and counteracting your opponent's plans. Luis, you talk about having a plan a lot. And that's something that, you've really sort of given to the show as far as encouraging people to be actively thinking about what is their plan to win the game? Where is this game going? How do they end up being the victor from each of these different scenarios, whether they're ahead or behind or whatever? But you do have to also try to match that up against what your opponent's doing. How do you do that on a base level about counteracting your opponent's plan?
Well, a really important distinction, that a lot of people don't get to is trying to think how your opponent is approaching the game. And once you do, you can start drawing ways to counteract it. Like when we talk about leaving mana up for counter spells, if I have a Glorybringer and it's game 2, you've seen it game 1, I probably won the game with it. And then you pass without playing something on your turn 5 and it's my turn 5 now. I'm not just going to slam Glorybringer into your 5 open mana.
Right.
I assume that you're a human being with a brain and a plan, and your plan is to leave up Electrify or Final Reward or cancel whatever your colors are, cast out, and stop my Glorybringer. Well, I don't have to cooperate with that plan. I can not play my Glorybringer. And in order to counter your opponent's plan, you have to think about what their plan is and what they're trying to accomplish. So level 1 is just playing the board. Level 2 is trying to beat your opponent playing the board. And level 3 is trying to beat your opponent when they're trying to beat you playing the board. So level 1 is tapping out on turn 5, right?
Yeah.
And then getting Glorybringered. Level 2 is leaving mana up to stop a Glorybringer that you predict is coming. Level 3 from your opponent is seeing that you left mana up, predicting it's to stop the Glorybringer and not playing the Glorybringer. And then that, brings the Glorybringer player to the point of just playing something else instead, or even maybe not playing anything. And it gets complicated. The reason Glorybringer is so good, by the way, is you can't out-level them by tapping out, because then they just play it and they win or get a huge advantage.
Exactly.
Sometimes you can. In a less extreme case than Glorybringer, you can not leave mana up for a counterspell, play something else instead to camouflage that you have a counter and leave mana up for it later when it's less obvious. Like when you only have 2 cards in your hand, maybe you actually just ran out of plays. But leaving a counterspell when you have 5 cards in your hand, well, your opponent's probably going to be able to predict it if they're, thinking about those things. Some people just look at their side of the board and don't think about their opponent at all. So those are the 3 levels, and those are kind of what you're striving for in this very simplified explanation, which is first, just play your game of Magic with the cards that are in front of you and the cards in your hand. Second, try to predict what cards are in your opponent's hand. Third, try to predict what your opponent's doing based on their prediction of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And it can dial up from there, but eventually gets kind of convoluted. But, you can take it to as many extremes as you think your opponent's going to. You just want to be a level ahead of them.
Yeah. And of course, when you do start thinking in these terms, this is where Magic becomes utterly fascinating. I mean, honestly, this is where the strategic parts of Magic just become insane because, what you end up having to do is make decisions, and you have to make these value judgments on what your decisions, your 2 or 3 decisions are in game, in the moment, that you are never going to have the actual answer for. And that's where it gets great. You mentioned the example of, okay, well, I think my opponent has left up an answer for my Glorybringer of some sort, so I've decided not to play it. Okay, that's good. That's smart. You're thinking about what your opponent's doing. But the really cool part comes in with, well, what if you have other options, right? do you have a 5-drop you could just play? Maybe you're okay with having your opponent answer that 5-drop so that then when you play the Glorybringer, it survives. Okay, that's something that you could think of. And how would you make that decision? Well, you need to know all the cards in the set. You need to know all the cards, that your opponent can have based on the colors that they're representing. You need to remember all the cards that they've played in the match so far in case some of them are relevant for that scenario. And then you need to start to adjust your factors based on, hey, I saw 3 copies of Electrify from my opponent in game 1. I know they have 3 of these things in their deck. They've got 5 mana and 5 cards in hand. The chance that they have an Electrify is just way too high. I'm not going to play my Glorybringer until the way is clear and I can at least get some value out of it, right? But maybe if you've got a Colossopede, you're like, sure, they can't counter it, so I'm just going to go ahead and play this Colossopede and their Electrify doesn't do anything, right? These are the little value judgments you're making. Then, maybe you even next level on top of that and say, you know what? They're playing blue and I've seen 2 Essence Cap. I'm not going to play anything. Like, I'm not going to play Glorybringer because I don't want to get it countered. I'm not even going to try to bait out a counterspell here and play my Colossopede. I'm just going to play nothing and say go because I'm slightly ahead on board and my opponent has to blink first anyway. Right. And so now, you're really starting to get into the depth of the game and starting to make these value judgments. And it's insane because, you get put on the spot on having to do something or not do something. And the people who are really good at that are the ones who win. Right. Because once you get this framework in place, you could go to Ben Stark, like Luis, you could go to him and say, here's a situation, and it can be complex like the one that we're describing here. And you can say, here's all the cards that we've seen. Here's what we know about our opponent's deck. Please tell me what you would do here. And, you guys might come to the same conclusion. You might not. But the key is that you're going to have a similar framework from which to work from. And even though the inputs that you put into that framework might be different, which is where things get super awesome because one of you's right or closer to right than the other one. And you don't really get to know, which is kind of a fun thing. You won't ever really know the answer to that. But at the end of the day, if you're right more often, you will win more games of Magic as you pick up those tiny edges over and over and over again. It's just really that leveling thing is really what makes like super high level Magic awesome. I mean, it's hard to see it, but when it pops up, it's really, really great.
Well, part of it too is, you have to figure out what level your opponent's on, and a lot of your opponents won't go very far up, so you can't really go that far up either. But when both players are just racing up on the levels, it gets really interesting and convoluted.
Yeah, it certainly does. Okay, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you very much to our patrons, and I've got more questions that will be coming in as well, and I'll be saving those or maybe even doing a new thread the next time we do this. But like I said, you can look forward to more episodes like this. I think that this is just such a great way to stay in contact with what our listeners really need, and that's of course why we're here. I try to keep up on that as much as possible, and this is just another way to do that. So thank you for all the awesome questions, and we'll be doing this again soon. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. I want to thank our sponsor, channelfireball.com. Make sure you check them out for all of your Magic needs. Very easy to get set up over there, and boom, you're off and running. They're the place to go to get everything you need Magic related. Channelfireball.com. That is going to do it for the show this week. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. We'll see you next time.
So I know this is limited resources, but I actually kind of wanted to highlight what I think is an underrated constructed format today, one that I think would resonate with a lot of our listeners. It's a format that I've played on and off and recently got to play some more. It's Pauper.
Pauper, yeah.
Yeah, Pauper is a lot of fun. Pauper is a constructed format. You can only play commons. You can play it on Magic Online. I've actually only played it online. I've never played it in paper. And it's surprisingly deep, very interesting, and as the name would suggest, pretty cheap to get into. That's part of the reason I think it's maybe a good fit for people who do a lot of drafting. Is it just doesn't take a huge investment to get into Pauper. Some of the cards online are randomly more expensive than you might think, just because they weren't printed that many times in their common form. Pyroblast $7 or whatever it is, but in general, it's really, compared to every other format, much cheaper to get into. And man, is it fun? I have no stake in it. I'm just saying that it's really fun to play, and it's something that if you are trying to look for a jump into constructed, especially if you're an exclusively limited player, this is a pretty good place to start. It's got a lot of really interesting gameplay. There's just a really wide variety of decks. The metagame seems very, very open, and there's just a lot of different play styles that you can really get into. I would one of the resources for it actually is the subreddit is just reddit.com/r/pauper. That's it, just pauper. And you can take a look. You can find deck lists, a lot of information there. It's just, like I said, surprisingly fun and complicated for what you think is a format of all commons. So I'm not saying that it is a simple format, but it's also just not that hard to get into. And a lot of the decks can play in a way that's just not that intimidating. You know, if you want to play your Goblins deck or your Elves deck, that is a great place to start. There's a lot of really cool decks that, you know, I've had a chance to play. Blue-red Delver of Secrets. There's a Tron deck using Dinrova Horror. There's all sorts of nonsense decks. And there's a lot of cool stuff going on. And I don't know, I advocate to giving the format a chance because it has a lot to offer. And I think it is underrated given how easy it is to get into and also how infrequently you have to, you know, drastically change decks. Like one of the things that people sometimes dislike about Standard is that it rotates frequently, or Modern is that, especially with the ban list, like what's good changes frequently. And Pauper, even though things change, first of all, it's just cheaper to get into, so that matters less. Also, a lot of the decks have seemed like they've stayed good for quite some time, even if they have to make adjustments. So just a format I had a chance to stumble onto again after some years of not playing it, and I was like, wow, this is a lot of fun. So
yeah, that's great.
And just to shine a light on it.
I like what you said too. I think it does appeal to our listeners just because, we like working with less, right? Like that's kind of what Limited's all about, is making it work with what you have. And I think that's really cool. I'll also put a link in the show notes to one of our longtime listeners, Alex Ullman, who's a huge Pauper advocate, and I'll put his Twitter in there. And I'm sure that if you have any questions or anything like that about Pauper, he would be happy to answer those questions for you. I'll put that in the show notes as well.